Hi, welcome to a new episode in the Internet Surfer, hosting the most horror and creepiest stories from Reddit. Please don't forget to comment, like, share, and subscribe. Enjoy.
What is the scariest/creepiest thing you have seen/heard? Episode 4. So many creepy things have happened in my family. My mom believes it is because my grandmother, Mom's mom, used to do black magic and curse at the devil. She's saved, Christian, now, but it still happens. Where to start? One of my oldest brothers when he was younger, about 14-15, used to get in a lot of trouble. He was always hanging out with the wrong kids, shoplifting, drinking, fighting, etc. One day he was about to meet with his so-called friends, when he saw a coffin float above his head, and it lowered enough so he could see it. He saw himself in that coffin. He ran straight to my grandmother's apartment and prayed the rest of the afternoon with her. He refused to let anyone in our family know what he was about to do that day, so I wouldn't know, sorry. My puny, little 4'2" grandmother has been exorcised, around 62 years old at the time. This happened a while after she got a call that one of her sons, my uncle, had gotten arrested and was in jail. I wasn't born yet, but two of my brothers, my, at the time, baby cousin, my uncle's wife, my aunt, and my mother were there. My mom said as they were beginning to exorcise her, she started speaking English. She only speaks Spanish, minus a couple English words like hello and such, and started to speak in tongues but in a very manly and deep voice, and that it just didn't sound like something that should be coming out of such a small woman. They started to forcefully hold her down onto the chair, and they said she was stronger than anything they could imagine. She's 87 now and has a sense of humor about it. Heck, one time at a family outing I had to share a room with her, and this was right after I was told about this story. She thought it would be hilarious if she just sat up in her bed staring at me for 5 minutes, but what felt like eternity, and fell back down to sleep. Next day she laughed about it with everyone in our family about how I was scared. Years ago, back when my family used to live in Puerto Rico and my mom and her siblings were kids, before my grandmother became Christian, she gambled a lot and would curse at the devil when she didn't win. I don't remember what exactly the game or whatever it was called, but it wasn't exactly a lottery. I'm not sure, I'll check with my mom later. But anywho, so one day she lost at this thing, and she threw pennies out the window and said something to the extent of, if this won't bring me any luck, then I'll take the devil's. They lived in a small house which was raised a couple of feet off the ground. That night, my mom said she heard about 10 or 15 cats underneath the floorboards, scratching and meowing. And when they meowed, it sounded like, "Maria, are you scared?" Last summer we had this huge family reunion. All of the older cousins slept in the same room, and the youngest cousin, 8 at the time and the only young one, he has a history of sleep-talking and night terrors, felt left out if he slept in his room because he wanted to be with the older kids. So, we're talking all night and it's about 3 in the morning and we decide it's time to hit the hay. About a half hour later, the lights flickered on and off, and we heard a scratching noise on the floor outside the door which irked everyone in an unsettling way. This kid rises from his bed and says, "I dare not speak of what I hear," and falls back into his slumber. An 8-year-old. A couple of years ago, I was left home alone. My dad was working the graveyard shift, brother was staying at his girlfriend's house, mom was staying overnight at the hospital to keep my grandfather company. So, I'm about to hit the hay, lying in bed still wide awake, lamp on. My cat absolutely lusses sleep right next to me, and I know what I experienced was real because she woke up and started hissing before anything started to happen. I heard footsteps but saw nothing. They got closer to me and my bed and got louder. All of a sudden I felt a shiver on my neck. This thing started to breathe into my ear. Then, what it sounded like, was this thing just took a whole bunch of glass and metal and threw it forcefully onto the ground right next to me, which startled me so much I couldn't even scream. I was so petrified. My cat's going ballistics right now. I don't think I had an inch of sleep that night. The next day when it was finally bright outside, I checked the kitchen to see if maybe I was just imagining things and maybe some dishes had fallen or something. Nothing. Now to just lighten up the mood after all these stories, my brother's a prankster. If he says to go along with something devious, I'll do it. A couple of years ago, I was doing my chores, and it was time to clean the bathroom. I hate chores, decided to have some fun before I indexed the mirror. So, I put some lotion on my hands and made a footprint on the bathroom mirror. You can make them by closing your hand into a fist and then using your thumb and fingers by making the big toe and all the other ones. I showed my brother because I thought it was pretty cool. He said to make a couple more and not to clean the mirror this time to see if my mom would notice. A couple of days go by, and my brother picks me up from a fun run event. He says in the car that our mom finally noticed the prints and that I shouldn't say anything, just go along with the plan. At the time, there were some kittens who were born in the shed in our backyard. When they meowed, it sounded like a baby crying. Epiphany, so my brother decided to say that we heard babies crying the other night, but we just played it off because we thought it was the kittens. Her mind is playing tricks on her and all this other mumbo-jumbo, so right away, she agrees and she's all, you know what, I think I heard those too. She calls my dad at work and tells him, and he's all skeptical, wife, you know they're always playing pranks. It's probably nothing. But you're not here, you don't know what we're seeing. My aunt is here with us too, and she's even more spiritual and Christian than my mother, and right away she says we need to call the pastor. My mom brushes it off and says to wait. If this keeps happening for the next couple of days, then she'll call. So, my aunt and mom go to the grocery store, do some errands, enough time for my brother to come up with something even more devious. He finds an audio recording of a baby crying, hooks it up to the surrounding sound in our living room, and puts it on a loop, just audible enough. So, they come back about an hour or two later. We're helping them bring in the groceries. After about 15 minutes, my aunt's all, what is that? My mother started bawling her eyes out and ran out of that house faster than Usain Bolt himself. She asked our neighbors if anyone was babysitting. Nope. Call the pastor. This was when my brother had to yank the phone out of my mom's hands and explain to her it was all just a prank. Then some beatings ensued.
I don't know if this can be classified as paranormal or mysterious, but simply weird. My boyfriend's mother decided to buy a house in the small town we were living in at the time, and we would rent it off to her. This was an old Ukrainian town with several abandoned buildings, including an old theater and an old hospital that was apparently haunted. Anyway, we go looking at houses, and there is one that a guy used to live in. His parents owned the house, and he was quite mentally unstable from what my boyfriend tells me. We go into the house. It's really old. There are affirmations on every door in paint. You are beautiful. Life is what you make it. Love unconditionally. The house is moderately well lit, but is in total shambles. My boyfriend, Jack, says he wants to see the downstairs. I'm spooked easily, so I didn't go with him. I'm wandering around the house when I hear Jack yell at me that I have to come downstairs and see this. I walk downstairs. The entire basement is dirt. There are piles of dirt all over the place, a shovel in one of them. There are a couple freestanding shelves with jars of Lord knows what on it. There is a wooden fence basically that has created a path to the end of the house. This fence is basically just plywood dug into the dirt. I walk all the way down the pathway to where Jack is standing, and he's pointing into this little room. It has no door but a red sheet hanging from the ceiling, and it's been pulled open and nailed to the wall, which is cement by the way. I look into the room, and there was just a bed on the floor, a side table with some crumpled up paper on it, and a light that was not turned on but was left on, with a red bulb, and it was swinging aggressively back and forth. It looked like a place where you would probably keep someone if you abducted them. I started crying. I was so scared. I went back upstairs, walked out of the house, and refused to go back inside. That night I had issues falling asleep. Ultimately, it was not up to me where we moved. It was up to his mother, and I was terrified. I am not even remotely spiritual, but I went and bought all these candles and rocks and smudge bundles to clear the house of whatever energy had followed me out of there. I finally fell asleep, and I am in the house again. I walk into the living room, and there is a little girl in the prettiest little red dress reaching her hand out to me. I grab onto it. She pulls me down, I kneel, and she says, "You cannot move into this house. Do not move into this house." I woke Jack up, and said this relationship would end before I'd move in that house.
When we went anywhere for a vacation, we always drove. It was cheap, and as kids the three of us were pretty well behaved in the car. Inevitably we'd be wide awake at night and insist that Dad tell us a ghost story, much to Mom's irritation. Years later, of course, I recognized the source materials for his stories as fragments from popular slasher flicks and common urban myths that we'd have been too young to hear. One time, he told us a story about a local myth that creeped the hell out because it sounded pretty plausible. Sometime just before the Civil War, an escaped slave had managed to flee north to the copper country and managed to get a job working in one of the mines. He got on well with everybody there and soon got the nickname Blackjack on account of his given name and his heritage. When rumors surfaced that he had violated someone's wife, a gang of 4 took it upon themselves to do something about him. Late on a full moon night, he was ambushed on the road and beaten to within an inch of his life by the 4 men, wearing all white in a prototypical KKK outfit. He lay dying in the ditch, and swore revenge upon those who had attacked him, offering his soul to the devil in exchange for revenge. Each month after for the next 4 months, one of the men who attacked him was found smashed into a nearly unidentifiable pulp by a massive hammer. Each time, a large, limping figure dragging a hammer behind him has been seen somewhere near the murderer. Thing is, Jack was rather uneducated and never stopped killing after the first 4, as he didn't know how many men attacked him. And so, he rises each month to slay the first person he finds wearing all white. So, the story goes, anyway. Like all ghost stories, it was pretty much designed to scare us stupid kids, and we kept trying to make it worse by pointing out white clothing we each were wearing at the time. By the next day, we'd largely forgotten about it. Several months later, we were on another trip and stopped at a motel for the night. I remember my dad not getting along with the guy behind the desk, some argument about price or something. Anyhow, I just recall that he was a bigger guy, balding, with a thick black beard. Most of all, I remember that he was wearing a stained white wife beater. Late that night, my parents were sleeping as was my youngest sister. The older of my 2 siblings and I were quietly playing cards by the window when I heard the sound of metal dragging against concrete. I shushed my sister and asked if she heard anything, and she said to stop trying to mess with her. Well, we wound up arguing and waking up Dad, who yelled at us to get back in our sleeping bags. We did, and everyone went back to sleep. That morning while we were packing, Dad went to pay the bill and came back looking actually scared, something I'd never seen before. He took Mom out of the room quietly and then she stayed in there with us while he went to a payphone out in the parking lot. I didn't know what happened at the time, but that when we left there were police cars and an ambulance in the parking lot, and Dad spent a lot of time talking to the police. Neither Mom nor Dad would tell us anything, and still don't like to talk about it at all. I was standing in front of my house with my dad on a spring day when I was 7. We were looking across the street at the neighbor's house, making casual conversation to pass the time. Suddenly, we see about 3 crows start to circle around the house. Then, one of the crows dives into our neighbor's yard and starts to pull apart their storm drain, the waterspout that catches roof water and sends it to the ground. It appeared that a family of finches had built a nest in the drain, and the crows wanted to eat the eggs. They succeeded. But that was not all. The crows then caught one of the finches, ripped its head off, and started to eat it. The other finch darted off in fright, abandoning its home. About 3 minutes later, the finch returns with about 50 other finches, and they start to attack the crows. The crows took down a couple more of the finches, but they were covered in a massive swarm of angry feathers. 2 of the crows were ripped to shreds within minutes, and the other one got away but fell to the ground after making it to a nearby hill, probably due to a damaged wing. It was very scary for my young mind, and I had just seen the horror movie, The Birds. After everything was done, my dad turns to me and says, "What is that?" That was the first time I heard him swear. My friend in her second year of college is away from home living in a 1-bedroom apartment by herself. Living alone, she was always super conscious of locking her doors and everything. Comes back from class one day and notices that her stuff was not how it was when she left, clothes on the floor, papers rustled, etc., and there was a picture on her floor of a little black boy, whom she had never seen before. Enough was out of place that she was way weirded out and she called the police. Police came to investigate, can't find any evidence of breaking and entering, and they asked if they could take her computer. They take it, she's freaked but she tries not to worry about it. Next day the police showed up, bring her the computer, and tell her that they found something on it. They open her Microsoft Word and find hundreds of letters to her. Weird-ass love letters talking about her. Every single one ended the same way: "If you don't believe me, just look under your bed." No joke, they look under her bed, lift up her mattress to find hundreds of used condoms. Needless to say, she noted right out there and moved back home the next day. Never found out who it was. Assumed it was someone working maintenance, considering doors were always locked and she came home to them locked when the incident occurred. My parents were out one night, and my brother and I were home alone. We were probably 12 and 10, respectively. Anyway, there's a knock at the door and I hear a voice say, "Pizza." Initially thinking it was my father playing a joke, I instinctively went to open the door when it hit me. That wasn't my dad's voice. "We didn't order any pizza," I said. There was no reply and no audible movement. I went to my bathroom window, which allows some vision of the footpath leading from the front of our property to the front door, but you can't see the door itself. So, we waited for about 15 minutes clutching a cricket bat and some ornamental fireplace poker until finally the man moved away from the door and walked away. Just some guy with dark hair in a long ponytail, a long dark coat, and no pizza. This is creepy, at least I always thought it was. I was working in a big grocery warehouse, hundreds of people worked there, it was night shift, sitting in a break room at lunch with a couple of other guys trying to find something to talk about to stay awake. I started talking about the best jobs I'd ever had. After a minute or so, this older guy who never ever said more than a word or two at a time starts telling us about this nursing home he used to work at. He was in his 60s and he'd already been at this current job for 30 plus years at the time, so his story took place when he was a young man, I surmised. He was an attendant for this nursing home, and he told us he used to meet with many of the female residents. These were elderly ladies and handicapped people as well. He told us he'd usually get it on with at least one of them every night and they were all incredibly grateful for his attention. He felt he was in heaven at the time. According to him, some of the ladies he was involved with were in their 80s and all of them were very lonely. He said his favorite was a younger woman who had cerebral palsy or some nerve disorder. He said that although she couldn't talk, he could tell she loved his attention by the way she'd squirm and wiggle. He told us he'd eventually been let go from this dream job, but not for what reason. When break was over, and he left the break room, me and the other guy sat there for a moment, and I asked him if he'd ever heard that story before. He said, "Hell no, I've never even heard him talk that long about anything before." The guy in question was always such a quiet guy, and I switched back to day shift not long after that, so I never talked about it with him again. But it really stuck in my mind in a creepy way. I think he believed what he said, but were these women his lovers or his victims? This happened to my horseback riding teacher's sister, Nancy, I think her name was, when I was like 9. It didn't freak me out so much at the time, but my mom reminded me of the story a few years ago and it's so creepy. So, Nancy went to the mall one day to run an errand. When she came out she had trouble finding her car by two trucks had parked on either side of it obscuring the view. So, she finally finds it and a well-dressed man, wearing a long dress coat, leather gloves, and holding a briefcase, comes up to her and asks for her help. His car broke down and he needed to get to a meeting and was hoping Nancy could drop him off at the train or bus stop about a mile from the mall. Nancy says yes and they get into her car. As soon as the doors close she knows something is wrong. She starts sweating and internally freaking out. All she knows is that she wants him out of her car. She did some very quick thinking and asked him to help guide her out of her parking spot, since the trucks on either side of her made it hard to see the rest of the traffic in the parking lot. As soon as he got out she locked the doors and sped away. Once safely on the freeway Nancy starts to feel extremely guilty and wonder if she was just being paranoid. She looks to her passenger seat and sees the man's briefcase. Relieved that she has a way to track him down and apologize she pulls over and opens it. The briefcase is empty except for a roll of duct tape and rope. This has kept me awake many nights over the past few years. Worked as a security guard in a hospital when my co-workers received a call from a woman who found a note from her husband. In that note he wrote he was going to kill himself and he also noted the exact area of where he would do it. Toilets. We thought it was a prank call but obviously we still had to check it out. The men's toilets were clear, next were the women's toilet. One door locked. Also, there was no response to our yelling and knocking, so we yelled we were going to open the door. And unlocked the door with the side of the key and opened it. What we saw there was absolutely horrific, not so much as in the gore but the way he took his own life. We found the man lying on the floor with a plastic bag taped around his head. Every item in his pocket was placed on the toilet: phone, cigarettes, lighter, wallet, etc. My colleague checked his pulse, but he was already cold. So, we were too late. We contacted the police, and my co-worker had his wife on the phone the whole time trying to comfort her as she wasn't allowed to tell anything about the state of her husband. That was up to the police to tell. Anyways, police removed the tape and found another plastic bag under the other one. When they removed the second plastic bag and tape we saw he also had put pieces of paper in his nose. So yes, this guy was a patient of the psych ward and decided to kill himself by suffocation. Anyway, never took a dump on that particular toilet again, neither did my co-workers. A few years ago, I was driving back to my house from a friend's at about 2 a.m. I was getting close to my house, in a really rural area with corn fields on both sides of the road. All of a sudden I saw stalks of corn blocking my path, going straight across the road from one field from another. Nobody is around, no cars, no houses, just my headlights shining on upright corn stalks standing across the road, as thick as the fields to either side. I knew I wasn't lost or anything. I drove home this way every day, and stopped the car on the road, just staring at the corn stalks trying to figure out what to do. After sitting there for a minute, I decided that staring at the corn waiting for something to happen was much scarier than doing something. So, I hit the gas, hoping the corn would just fall down in front of my small car. It was one of the strangest feelings driving through the corn. I imagine it is what it would feel like to run through platform 9¾ for Harry Potter. 1 second I was staring at what seemed to be a solid field of corn, and the next my car was easily knocking the stalks over and I was through. The rows of corn across the road weren't as deep as I had thought, and in no time I was on the other side looking in the rear-view mirror at a wall of corn with a now gaping hole in it. Went home, went to bed still freaked out. The next morning, I went to leave, drove down the same road, and the only sign of the corn was a few stalks lying next to the road. I still have no idea how that happened. About 5 years ago on Valentine's Day I was with my fiancée, now wife. We had just finished dinner, and it was about 11 p.m. She lived pretty close to a cemetery and was always talking about how many deer she'd see out there at night and she wanted to show me, so we drove out there. So, we pulled in and immediately saw a huge black object about 30 feet from the car directly in front of us. It was a good 7 feet tall and had this black robe on, Grim Reaper style, moving across the road. I say moving because there wasn't a noticeable step. It wasn't going up and down. It was like floating across the road like it was on a skateboard or something. So, we were pretty scared then, but we couldn't turn around because the road was pretty narrow, so I drove a little farther until there was a fork I could start heading back, see linked image. So, we got back around, and it had just made its way across on the shorter road, and by the time we saw it again it was just standing in the road looking at us. Right before this we were pretty freaked, but when it was just standing looking at us it was the most scared I've ever been. Our lights were shining right on it and there was nothing in the face. The light wasn't reflecting or anything, just black. It looked at us for about 30 seconds and then just turned and kept going the way it was originally. I gunned it and went as fast as I could out of there. I would have thought I was crazy if my fiancé hadn't been there to see it too. I was sitting in the living room reading a magazine once, with the balcony windows open to let some breeze in. All of a sudden my glass of water on the coffee table started to slowly shake, some magazines fell onto the floor. There was a very vibrant whoosh coming from the sky that was getting louder and louder. The whole house was shaking, and car alarms were going off in the neighborhood. I was scared for my life. I ran to my bed and went under the blankets, all curled up, thinking the world is ending and the sky is falling. My cat ran up to me and hid under the bed. The whoosh came and went really loudly, almost deafening me. After a while of silence, I stood up and went over to the balcony. Some neighbors were outside their houses, wondering what had just happened. There was some broken pottery and spilled drinks, but that was all the damage. And then the house started to shake again. Curious, I decided to stay on the balcony and hold on. All of a sudden, 2 army jets flew past really low. 2 Russian Sukhoi made a low flyby and then disappeared behind the mountains. Turned out they were practicing for some parade. I grew up in the South in the late 70s and early 80s. My grandmother lived on a cotton farm in SC, and my cousin and I would go visit her during the summer. We'd help out on the farm, but during the heat of the day we'd go swimming in the river to cool off. Our favorite spot was fairly isolated, so we never really saw anyone else, but there was an old dirt road that ran from the gravel road back to an abandoned farmhouse in the woods. My cousin and I were in the river when we saw a cloud of dust in the distance. We thought maybe our uncle was coming to take us back to the farm, but we always swam for an hour or so after lunch, and he never drove the tractor to come get us. We'd heard stories about some backwoods family who'd gone all deliverance on some kids a few summers ago, but we figured it had to just be our uncle trying to freak us out. Regardless, we snuck up to the riverbank so we could see the dirt road, but we'd still be hidden in the trees. We saw a ratty Oldsmobile Delta 88 with blacked-out windows creeping down the dirt road. The car didn't belong to anyone we knew. I only remember the make and model because I knew it was the Evil Dead car, and because of what happened next. After it passed by our hiding spot, we noticed it didn't have a license plate. It drove another 30 yards or so and then stopped. A black garbage bag flew out of the passenger window and into the field. It was about the size of a football. Then the car made a slow and methodical 3-point turn, taking great pains not to let the tires venture too far into the cotton field. It made its way back the direction it came, until it disappeared out of sight. My cousin and I remained silent throughout the event, and with the car gone we looked at each other. I wish we had just ignored it. I wish we had headed back to the farm. I wish we had told our uncle or our grandmother what we had seen and had them come to investigate. But we were 13. Curiosity was killing us. We had to look in that bag. As we left our hiding place and headed down the road, we looked around nervously, hoping the Delt wouldn't show up again. As we got close to the drop zone, we could see blood on some of the cotton directly above the bag's resting place. We looked at each other one last time, and then we opened the bag. There, in the bottom of the bag, wrapped in a bloody washcloth, was a tiny baby girl. She looked like she might have just been asleep, but she wasn't. The image of her lying there, naked, bloody, and discarded, has haunted me ever since. I was visiting my dad in Portland as his job required a temporary relocation from Michigan. My mother, brother, and I took 10 days hitting spots all over Oregon and Washington state. We ended up at Multnomah Falls, a popular state park and tourist attraction. When we flew back to Michigan, he was going through his camera while he listened to the news and heard that someone had died at the falls that day. It's not uncommon for suicides to happen in places like the falls, but as he was scrolling through the pictures, he was curious at what time the suicide occurred, because my dad had one of those cameras that time-stamped every photo. The news reported the time of the body's discovery as my dad fell onto a picture time-stamped 3 minutes prior to that time. At the top of the falls, in my family photo, there stands a man at the edge minutes from jumping to his death. My wife is an RN, and she was on float to another unit helping out. She normally worked cardiac, but she was helping out in the Alzheimer's unit. She was saving a particular patient for last as the patient was known to be a real pain. Incredibly old, mean to everyone and just generally tried to make the nurses miserable. She and the respiratory therapist got to the patient's room at the same time, so they decided to tackle her together. They got into the room and the patient had smeared shit all over the walls of the bathroom and the hospital room. She was standing on the bed screaming and jumping up and down on the bed. The two of them somehow got the patient calmed down, got the horrible mess cleaned up, and got their jobs done. She said it took about 3 hours. They then went out and put a do not disturb sign on the door to make sure the patient could stay calm and get some sleep. They were standing one person on each side of the door, herself and the respiratory therapist, catching their breath and proclaiming how much that sucked when they spotted someone. A big farmer-looking guy wearing a John Deere baseball cap, overalls, a red plaid checkered shirt and big work boots coming down the hospital hallway, and he looked kind of annoyed. He walked right past them into the patient's room, slamming the door open. My wife caught the door on the back swing and marched right into the room after him, respiratory therapist right behind her, planning on dragging him back out and giving him a piece of her mind. When she got into the room, he was not there. No sign of the person she followed in. She looked under the bed. She looked in the bathroom. She checked behind all of the curtains. She even made sure the window still would not open. No sign of the farmer at all. She then noticed the patient was sitting upright in the bed, just kind of staring off into space. So, she asked her, "Did you just see someone come into the room?" The patient said, "Yes, it was my daddy. He said he was coming to take me home tonight and that you mean people won't be able to hurt me anymore." She responded with, "That's great, how about you get some rest before he comes to pick you up?" The patient then lay down and went to sleep. The patient died that night. My wife and the respiratory therapist swapped stories to make sure they were not crazy. They both saw it. Driving to pick up a friend who was at this cabin party about 40 miles west of where I lived. It was close to 2 a.m. So, I'm driving down this back road to find this random cabin somewhere and I come across this red 4-door sedan with all the doors open and 4 limp figures in the seats with their heads slumped over. That alone kind of freaked me out. Later on, I'm driving by again after a failed attempt at picking up my friend. Mind you, it's getting close to 3 in the morning, and only the front seat passenger door was open and every person in that car was staring with a blank dead stare directly at me as I drove past at 10 miles per hour. Very creepy to me.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.